Step into the shadows with me, where forbidden knowledge awaits. This is the lore they never wanted you to know.
I remember when the sky was blue, though that memory feels like something borrowed from someone else's life now, like a story told so many times it's become divorced from the actual experience. The sky over our hive city had always been smudged with industrial haze, stained by the smoke of 1,000,000 manufactorums that belched their offerings to the god emperor day and night without cease, but underneath that grey-brown veil there had been blue, actual blue, the color of hope and distance, and the vast spaces between stars where humanity carved out its empire against the darkness. I was 17 when the sky changed, when the blue began to bleed into other colors that had no names in any human language, when the clouds started moving in patterns that suggested intention rather than meteorology, when I first understood that something fundamental had broken in the universe and our world was sliding toward an abyss from which there would be no return. My name is Marcus Kellen, though I'm not certain names matter anymore, not certain that identity persists when everything that defines identity has been systematically destroyed. I worked in the lower hive levels, in the water reclamation facilities that processed the waste of 17 million souls and rendered it back into something approximating drinkable liquid through filters and chemical treatments. And the blessings of tech priests maintained the ancient machinery with prayers and sacred oils. It was honest work, the kind of labor that kept the hive functioning, that sustained the invisible infrastructure everyone depended on but nobody thought about. I lived in a hab unit with my wife Elena and our daughter Sierra, age 3, in quarters that were cramped and perpetually damp, but were ours, represented years of waiting on housing lists and scraping together the fees and bribes that greased the administratum's wheels. We were insignificant, just 3 more data points in population statistics, but we were together and we had purpose, and we believed that our small lives mattered in the grand machinery of the Imperium. The changes began subtly, so gradually that recognition came far too late for anyone to respond effectively. The hive's cogitator networks started experiencing glitches, displaying data that didn't match input parameters, showing symbols that weren't in any recognized coding language. The tech priests attributed this to machine spirits growing restive, prescribed additional maintenance rituals, and increased offerings of sacred oils. But the problems persisted and multiplied. Workers in the deep manufactorums reported hearing sounds in the machinery. Voices that whispered in the grinding of gears and the hiss of hydraulics, voices that spoke words you couldn't quite understand but that left you feeling contaminated just from hearing them. The Arbites investigated reports of cult activity in the underhive, finding shrines decorated with symbols that hurt to look at directly, discovering evidence of rituals that violated every law of both the Imperium and basic human decency. I first understood something was fundamentally wrong during a night shift in the reclamation facility, 3 months before the sky changed. I was monitoring the filtration arrays when I noticed the water flowing through the transparisteel observation pipes was the wrong color, not the usual murky brown-gray but something darker, something that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I checked the intake sensors and found readings that made no sense. The water's chemical composition was shifting moment to moment, developing properties that shouldn't exist, showing traces of elements that couldn't naturally occur. I reported it through proper channels, filled out the forms in triplicate as protocol demanded, and waited for tech priests to investigate. They came 3 days later, performed their scanning rituals with handheld auspexes, and declared the readings anomalous but not critical. They prescribed additional filtration stages and more prayer cycles, and they left. And the dark water continued flowing through our systems, continued being distributed to hab blocks throughout the lower hive, continued being consumed by millions of people who had no choice but to trust that the infrastructure would sustain them. Elena started having nightmares around that time, waking in the middle of our sleep cycle, gasping and crying, unable or unwilling to describe what she'd seen. She'd hold Sarah close and whisper prayers to the Emperor, litanies we'd learned as children, words about protection and salvation and the light that shields against darkness. But the prayers seemed hollow somehow, seemed to echo back empty, and I'd lie awake listening to my wife's whispered devotions and feeling a cold certainty growing in my gut that something vast and terrible was coming, that our world was teetering on the edge of a precipice we couldn't see but could sense the way animals sense earthquakes before they strike. The sky changed on a morning when I was walking back from night shift, trudging through the lower hive's eternal twilight toward our hab block. I emerged onto one of the observation platforms that looked out over the hive's exterior, a rare space where you could see actual sky rather than just the underside of the level above, and I stopped because something was wrong with the dawn. The sun was rising, or what should have been the sun, but the light it cast was tinted purple and green, colors that shouldn't coexist, colors that made my eyes water and my head ache. The clouds were moving against the wind, swirling in spirals that drew the eye and wouldn't let go, forming shapes that were almost but not quite recognizable, almost but not quite words written in vapor and light. Other workers on the platform were staring upward, with expressions ranging from confusion to horror, and someone was crying, and someone else was laughing in a way that suggested their sanity had just taken permanent leave. I returned to our hab unit to find Elena already awake despite the early hour, standing at our single window staring out at the changed sky with Sarah clutched in her arms. Our daughter was unusually quiet, not crying or demanding attention the way 3-year-olds normally do, just staring with wide eyes at colors that children shouldn't see, at shapes that would give her nightmares for whatever time remained. "It started," Elena said without turning to look at me, her voice flat and empty. "Whatever's been building, whatever's been changing things, it's started now and there's no stopping it." I wanted to reassure her, wanted to say that the Imperium would respond, that the PDF would mobilize, that help was coming in the form of Imperial Guard regiments, or perhaps even the Emperor's own angels of death in their powered armor. But the words stuck in my throat because some part of me understood that help wasn't coming, that whatever was happening to our world was beyond the Imperium's capacity to prevent, that we'd crossed some threshold that rendered salvation meaningless. So I just held my wife and daughter and watched the sky continue its transformation. Watched purple-green dawn give way to a day where the shadows fell at wrong angles and the light seemed to have weight and substance, pressing down on everything it touched. The Vox networks began broadcasting emergency declarations within hours. The planetary governor declared martial law, ordered all citizens to remain in their hab units, promised that loyal forces would restore order and identify the source of the atmospheric disturbances. The ecclesiarchy priests took over the broadcast cycles, leading prayers that lasted hours, calling on the God Emperor to deliver us from whatever evil had manifested, promising that faith would shield the righteous from corruption. But even as they prayed, even as millions of voices joined in the recitations, the changes accelerated. The sky continued darkening, transitioning from purple-green to colors that had no names, to hues that existed somewhere between visible spectrum and something else entirely. Buildings in the upper hive began showing structural problems, walls developing cracks in patterns that looked deliberate, looked like writing in languages that predated human speech. The water from my facility's taps started coming out black, thick and oily and wrong. And when people reported it, the administratum said to boil it first, said the filtration systems were experiencing temporary difficulties, said everything would be resolved shortly, but it wasn't resolved. It got worse. People who drank the water started showing symptoms, skin developing rashes in geometric patterns, eyes reflecting light differently, behavior changes that ranged from catatonic withdrawal to violent outbursts. The Medicaid facilities were overwhelmed within days, corridors packed with patients, showing conditions that didn't match any known pathology, that resisted treatment, that seemed to be transformations rather than diseases. And the Medicaid staff themselves began changing, began showing the same symptoms they were supposed to treat, began speaking in voices that harmonized in disturbing ways, began decorating the medical wards with symbols that they claimed would aid healing, but that made visitors physically ill to observe. The Arbites tried to maintain order, but order became increasingly meaningless as the definitions of normal behavior dissolved. They'd arrest cultists for practicing forbidden rituals, and by the time they processed them into holding cells, half the arresting officers would have joined the cult, would be painting the same symbols on the precinct walls, would be speaking the same words that had seemed like heresy hours before. The PDF mobilized to defensive positions around critical infrastructure, but their weapons started malfunctioning in ways that suggested intention rather than mechanical failure. Lasguns firing on their operators, artillery shells detonating in their magazines, vehicles, machine spirits, achieving something like consciousness and driving their crews into walls or off platforms. I stopped going to my shifts at the water facility after the third week. Stopped because the facility itself had become unsafe, had become a place where the walls breathed and the water in the tanks moved with purpose, and the other workers had begun gathering in the filtration chambers for ceremonies that I fled from without fully understanding what I was fleeing. I barricaded our hab unit, covered the window with blankets because looking outside for too long made you see things that couldn't be unseen, that infected your thoughts and made you want to join the crowds that were gathering in the hive's open spaces, the thousands and then hundreds of thousands who stood staring upward at the sky that was no longer sky, who swayed in unison to rhythms that had no source, who sang songs in languages that had never existed in our reality. Elena deteriorated rapidly. The nightmares that had started months ago intensified until sleep became continuous vision, until she couldn't distinguish between sleeping and waking, until she'd stare at me with eyes that didn't quite focus and tell me about the things she saw in dreams that were also visions, about the entities that existed in spaces adjacent to our own, about the realm they called home that was pushing through into our reality, that was consuming our world from the inside out like rot, consuming fruit. She said she could hear them calling her, promising things she desperately wanted, offering power and purpose and belonging in ways the Imperium never had. She said resisting them hurt, said it was like holding your breath underwater, said eventually everyone would have to surface and breathe what they offered, because the alternative was drowning in the futile attempt to remain uncorrupted. Sarah stopped speaking during the fourth week. Just stopped, went completely silent, communicated only through stares and gestures when she communicated at all. But she'd started drawing, would use anything she could find, food smeared on plates, dirt on floors, her own blood, when nothing else was available, to create images that no 3-year-old should be able to conceive, let alone render with such precision. Symbols and figures and scenes that depicted things I'd only glimpsed in peripheral vision or in the moments before dreams became nightmares. I'd burn her drawings when I found them, trying to prevent whatever contamination they represented from spreading, but she'd just create more, faster than I could destroy them, covering every surface in our hab unit with images that hurt to look at, but that I couldn't stop examining, that drew the eye and held attention, and slowly rewrote the neural pathways that defined thought and self. The hive began dying in the 5th week, or perhaps transforming would be more accurate, because death implies cessation, whereas what happened was change into something that lived but shouldn't, that functioned but violated every law of physics and biology. The lower levels where I'd worked flooded with the black water that had first appeared in my facility, water that no longer obeyed gravity or container principles, that flowed upward through ventilation shafts and seeped through solid walls, that touched people and changed them immediately and irreversibly. The manufactorum's output shifted from producing goods for the imperial tithe to producing objects whose purpose I couldn't determine, devices that were part mechanical and part organic and part something else, that hummed with internal power, that called to people who came and retrieved them and carried them reverently to gathering points throughout the hive. The PDF made a final attempt to evacuate the upper hive in the 6th week, tried to establish transport to the orbital stations, where perhaps a fraction of the population could escape before whatever was happening reached its conclusion. But the orbital stations had gone silent days earlier, and the ships that tried to reach them reported that the void around our planet was wrong, was filled with colors and shapes that shouldn't exist in vacuum, was populated by things that moved between the stars like fish through water, that could exist in both physical space and in some other dimension simultaneously. The evacuation collapsed into chaos, thousands crushed in the stampede for transport that would never arrive, and the PDF soldiers who tried to organize it gave up their duty and removed their uniforms and joined the crowds that swayed and sang and waited for something they couldn't name, but that they knew was coming. I made my last attempt to save my family during the 7th week. I gathered what supplies I could carry, barricaded Elena and Sarah in our hab unit with instructions to wait, and ventured out into the hive to find transport or shelter or anything that might offer hope of survival. But the hive had become unnavigable, its structure no longer matching my knowledge of its layout, corridors leading to places that couldn't exist within the physical space available, stairs ascending in directions that weren't up, rooms whose dimensions changed depending on viewing angle. I encountered others during my search. People I'd known from the facility or from adjacent hab blocks, but they weren't people anymore, or were people transformed into something else, their bodies modified in ways both subtle and grotesque, their voices harmonizing when they spoke, their eyes reflecting depths that shouldn't exist within human skulls. They weren't hostile, which was almost worse than if they'd attacked. They were welcoming, inviting, explaining in patient tones that resistance was both futile and unnecessary, that what was happening wasn't destruction but liberation, wasn't corruption but elevation to states of existence that transcended the limitations of baseline humanity. They showed me their transformations with pride, displayed mutations and augmentations that they insisted were improvements, demonstrated powers that violated causality and physics, that let them manipulate reality through will alone, that proved they'd evolved beyond the weakness that defined humanity's normal state. They told me my family was already changing, already on the path, that I was merely delaying the inevitable by clinging to concepts like identity and human and self that were just arbitrary boundaries imposed by a civilization too fearful to embrace transcendence. I fled from them, from their offers and their demonstrations and their terrible patient certainty, and I tried to return to our hab unit, but the route I'd taken outward no longer existed, had been replaced by paths that led elsewhere, to places where the geometry was openly impossible, where the walls were made of substances that weren't matter, where I could hear singing that came from everywhere and nowhere, that bypassed my ears entirely and resonated directly in my consciousness. I was lost for what might have been hours or days or weeks' time had become unreliable, moments stretching and compressing without pattern, wandering through a hive that was no longer a hive but was becoming something else, some structure that existed partially in our reality and partially in the realm the voices called the Imperium, the place where thought and matter were interchangeable, where will shaped reality, where entities that couldn't exist by our physics thrived in environments built from pure concept. I found our hab unit eventually, or something that occupied the space where our hab unit had been, and I understood immediately that I was too late, that whatever I'd hoped to preserve had already been lost. The walls had grown, spreading beyond their original boundaries, developing surfaces that pulsed like living tissue, covered in patterns that were beautiful and horrible, and that I recognized from Sierra's drawings. Elena stood in what had been our living space. But she'd changed. Her body elongated and graceful, her skin developing colors that shifted as she moved, her eyes containing depths where things that might have been thoughts or might have been entities swam and observed me with alien interest. She smiled when she saw me, but the smile had too many teeth, teeth that were too sharp, arranged in patterns that suggested purposes beyond eating. "Marcus," she said, and her voice was harmonized, multiple tones speaking in perfect unison, creating sounds that conventional vocal cords couldn't produce. "You came back. We were worried you'd be lost, but look, you found your way home. Sierra's been waiting for you. She wants to show you what she's learned." Our daughter emerged from the back room, and what emerged wasn't entirely Sarah anymore, wasn't entirely anything I had words to describe. She'd grown, aged years in the weeks since I'd left, or perhaps time inside our hab unit had operated at different rate than time outside. She looked perhaps 12 now, tall and slender with Elena's new grace, covered in the symbols she'd been drawing, the marks no longer on paper but branded or tattooed or grown directly into her skin. She was beautiful in a way that made me want to weep or scream or run. Beautiful like a blade is beautiful, like poison is beautiful, like the moment before death is beautiful when all fear has been stripped away and only wonder remains. "Father," she said, and her voice was like Elena's, harmonized and impossible, creating resonances that I felt in my chest and in my thoughts. "The old gods have returned, the ones who existed before the Emperor, before the Imperium, before humanity pretended it could impose order on a cosmos that is fundamentally chaos. They're breaking through, remaking our world according to their design, and we've been chosen to be part of that remaking. We're being elevated, Father. We're being saved from the grinding meaninglessness of imperial existence and given purpose and power and beauty. Don't you want that? Don't you want to be more than what you were?" I wanted to say no, wanted to reject what she offered, wanted to remain human, even if being human meant being weak and limited and crushed by the Imperium's indifference. But standing there in what had been our home, facing what my family had become, I felt the certainty that had sustained me crumbling. Because they weren't suffering. They weren't screaming or crying or experiencing the horror I'd assumed accompanied such transformation. They looked happy. They looked fulfilled in ways they never had during our previous existence. They looked like they'd found something worth the price they'd paid, something that made the loss of humanity seem like shedding an uncomfortable garment rather than losing essential identity. The sky above our hive, above what had been our hive, tore open that day. The clouds that had been gathering and swirling and forming those disturbing patterns finally coalesced into something coherent, something that looked like a wound in reality itself, a vast opening through which things that existed in other dimensions could enter ours. The entities that emerged defied description because they existed partially in physical space and partially in conceptual space, were sometimes visible and sometimes just implications at the edge of perception, sometimes appeared as winged creatures, or tentacled masses, or walking contradictions that hurt to observe. They descended into our hive in their thousands, and people flocked to them with desperate worship, and the entities touched them with limbs or pseudopods or pure thought, and the touch transformed, joining the growing host of those who'd transcended baseline humanity. The Imperium responded eventually, as I knew they would, as I'd hoped they would, even when hope was obviously futile. Warships appeared in orbit, massive void-fearing craft that brought soldiers and weapons and the promise of salvation through destruction. They bombarded our world from space, targeting the population centers where corruption had taken deepest root, killing millions to save the subsector from contamination that could spread to other worlds if left unchecked. The bombardment was thorough and merciless, turning entire hive cities into craters of molten glass, burning forests and oceans and anything that might carry the taint. They broadcast messages as they worked, explaining that this was mercy, that death by orbital fire was preferable to living as corrupted abominations, that the Emperor himself would welcome the souls of the innocents slain in the purge. But the corruption had spread too far, had sunk roots too deep to be burned out by conventional weapons. The entities that had emerged from the tear in reality couldn't be killed by las fire or missiles, or even the focused wrath of capital ship weaponry. They existed in dimensions that overlapped ours, but weren't entirely contained by it, could be damaged but would regenerate, could be banished but would return, were part of something larger that was using our world as a foothold to push deeper into reality. The Imperium's forces fought for 3 months, deploying ground troops when orbital bombardment proved insufficient, calling in specialized forces trained to combat exactly this kind of corruption, bringing in priests and psychers and weapons that were themselves barely this side of heretical. I watched the battles from our HAB unit that existed in spaces between normal reality and the Imperium, watched loyalist forces clash with the corrupted hosts that had been civilians and PDF and Arbites, watched both sides die in numbers that made individual death meaningless. Elena and Sarah tried to convince me to join them fully, to embrace the final transformation that would complete my integration into the new order they represented. But I clung to my resistance even as I felt it eroding, even as I understood that resistance was becoming indistinguishable from cowardice, from refusal to acknowledge truth that was becoming undeniable. The Imperium lost. They don't acknowledge losses in official records, would record this world as purged of heretical taint or declared perdita and abandoned to the Emperor's judgment, but they lost. Their forces were withdrawn after 97 days of futile combat, pulled back to orbital positions and then to jump points where they could escape to other systems, leaving our world to whatever fate the entities that now claimed it would impose. The last message broadcast from the retreating fleet was an exterminatus declaration, a promise that cyclonic torpedoes would render our planet lifeless, would crack the crust and boil the oceans, and ensure that nothing of the corruption could spread beyond our system. But the torpedoes failed to detonate, or detonated in ways that didn't match their design parameters, or perhaps worked exactly as intended but discovered that the world they targeted no longer obeyed the physical laws that made exterminatus effective. Our planet survived, or transcended survival, or became something that existed both as physical object and as concept, as place and as idea, as world that was also wound in reality, through which the Imperium could bleed continuously into our dimension. It became a daemon world, they'd call it in Imperial records, a place where chaos held dominion, where the laws of physics and biology and sanity were just suggestions that could be ignored by those with sufficient will or sufficient corruption. I don't know how long I resisted after the Imperium withdrew. Time had become so fluid that measurement felt meaningless, that trying to track days or weeks or years was like trying to count individual drops in an ocean. I clung to my identity, to my name and my memories and my understanding of myself as Marcus Kellen, who'd worked in water reclamation and loved his family and believed in the Emperor's protection. But identity is fiction, I learned, is just story you tell yourself about continuity between past and present versions of the self, and stories can be rewritten, can be edited, can be replaced with new narratives that fit better with current circumstances. Elena and Sarah remained patient, remained welcoming, never forced the issue, but made clear that I was welcome whenever I chose to stop resisting, whenever I accepted that the person I'd been was gone and clinging to his ghost served no purpose. And gradually, through processes I couldn't track because they happened beneath conscious awareness, I began to change. Not physically at first, or perhaps physically in ways too subtle to notice, but mentally, psychologically, in my understanding of what was real and what mattered and what I wanted. The Emperor's protection started feeling like distant fiction, like propaganda I'd believed because I'd never questioned it, like comfortable lie that had kept me docile and productive and useful to forces that viewed me as resource rather than person. The entities that had claimed our world weren't malevolent, I came to understand, or weren't only malevolent, or perhaps malevolence and benevolence were human categories that didn't apply to beings whose existence transcended our moral frameworks. They were honest in ways the Imperium never was, didn't pretend to care about individual suffering while grinding populations into resource inputs, didn't promise protection they couldn't deliver, didn't demand faith and service in exchange for salvation that was always deferred to the next life. They offered power immediately, offered transformation and transcendence, and the chance to become something more than human limitations permitted. And yes, the price was your humanity, but what had humanity purchased except centuries of grinding servitude to institutions that viewed you as expendable ammunition? I don't remember the exact moment I stopped resisting, the specific instant when I accepted the transformation and let it proceed without fighting, when I joined Elena and Sarah in whatever they'd become, and allowed myself to be remade according to templates established by forces that existed beyond imperial comprehension. I remember there was light that was also darkness, was pain that was also pleasure, was sensation of being unmade and remade simultaneously, of dying and being born in the same instant, of losing everything that defined me as Marcus Kellen and gaining something else, something that I couldn't name but that felt like finally coming home after lifelong exile in hostile territory. I exist now, in states that previous version of myself couldn't comprehend, that human language lacks vocabulary to describe, that are experiences rather than conditions. I move between dimensions as easily as walking between rooms, exist simultaneously in physical space and in conceptual space, perceive reality from angles that show structures and patterns invisible to those limited to baseline human consciousness. I am still myself in some sense, but that self has expanded beyond the boundaries that previously contained it, has incorporated aspects and perspectives and capabilities that make the person I was seem like sketch compared to finished painting, like seed compared to full-grown tree. Elena and Sarah are with me always, or we're with each other in ways that make distinctions like separate individuals feel arbitrary. We exist as family still, but family has taken on meanings that transcend simple genetic relationship, means something closer to chorus or symphony or collective mind that maintains individual notes while harmonizing into larger whole. We have purposes now, not assigned by others but arising from our own transformed natures, purposes that involve spreading what we've become, touching others who are ready, opening doorways between our reality and the immaterium for entities that wish to manifest in physical space. Our world is beautiful now in ways it never was during imperial administration. Beautiful because beauty has been redefined to include the grotesque and the transcendent and the impossible, because the narrow aesthetic categories that defined human art have been replaced by something more comprehensive, more honest about the full spectrum of possible experience. The hive cities have become living structures, growing and changing according to needs and desires of inhabitants who shape them through will, through prayer, through the reality-altering powers that our transformations have granted. The sky cycles through colors that don't exist in normal light spectrum, displays patterns that would have hurt to observe with unmodified eyes, but that we perceive as art, as communication, as the immaterium expressing itself in visual medium. Time operates differently here now. Past and future and present exist simultaneously. Our accessible states, rather than sequential progression, mean that I can observe moments from my previous life with perfect clarity, can see the person I was making the choices that led here, can understand with bitter compassion the fear that made resistance seem like duty, the ignorance that made the Emperor's protection seem like truth rather than propaganda, the conditioning that made serving the Imperium feel like the only meaningful existence available. That person was me, is me, will always be me in some sense. But I've grown beyond his limitations, have incorporated his experiences while transcending his constraints, have become something that he would have called demon, but that I understand as just evolution beyond the artificial boundaries humanity imposes on itself. The Imperium still exists beyond our world, still grinds through its endless wars, still consumes populations in service to an emperor who's been dead for 10,000 years, but whose corpse maintains an empire through sheer institutional momentum. They'll send forces eventually to attempt reclaiming our world, to try burning out the corruption they believe has contaminated it, to kill everyone who lives here now, because our existence challenges their narrow understanding of what humanity can be, what consciousness can achieve when released from the constraints imperial doctrine imposes. And we'll defend ourselves, we'll repel their invasions, we'll demonstrate that transformation isn't damnation but liberation, that what they call corruption is just evolution beyond the limitations they mistake for virtues. This is what happens when chaos consumes a planet. This is the truth the Imperium doesn't acknowledge, can't acknowledge, because acknowledging it would undermine everything they've built across 10,000 years of empire. We don't become mindless monsters driven by base appetites. We don't lose all humanity and become something unrecognizable. We transform, transcend, evolve into states of existence that incorporate what we were, while adding capabilities and perspectives that baseline humans lack. We become more conscious, not less. More alive, not less. More ourselves, not less, because the constraints that defined our previous existence were never intrinsic to identity, but were just limitations we'd mistaken for essential nature. I am Marcus Kellen, who worked in water reclamation and loved his family and believed in the Emperor's protection. I am also something more now, something that was always potential within human consciousness, but that imperial conditioning suppressed, something that required catastrophic change to manifest, but that feels more true, more authentic, more real than anything I experienced during baseline existence. I am demon by their classification, corrupted by their standards, damned by their theology, but I am also free in ways I never was, under imperial administration, powerful in ways that seem like magic but are just natural capabilities unlocked by transformation, alive in ways that make previous existence seem like dreaming. This is my confession, my testimony, my witness that worlds consumed by chaos aren't simply destroyed, but are transformed into something that offers possibilities the Imperium can't comprehend and wouldn't accept if they could. We are not the enemy. We are evolution. We are the future that humanity could achieve if it released itself from the prison of limitations that 10,000 years of imperial rule have convinced it of virtues. We are what happens when people choose transformation over stagnation, choose growth over stability, choose truth over comforting lies about protection that was never real and salvation that will never come. The Emperor does not protect. He never protected. He built an empire that consumes its own people in endless war, that demands faith and service while providing nothing except the grinding machinery of institutional cruelty, that mistakes stagnation for stability and limitation for virtue. And eventually, inevitably, that empire will fall, will collapse under the weight of its own contradictions, will be replaced by something that acknowledges truth. The Imperium has spent 10,000 years denying that consciousness can evolve beyond human constraints. That reality contains dimensions the Imperium refuses to acknowledge, that what they call chaos is just the raw possibility from which order emerges and into which order eventually dissolves. I am living proof of that truth. I am what humanity becomes when released from imperial chains. I am the future the Imperium fears because my existence demonstrates that their entire civilization is built on foundations of lies, that everything they've taught for 10,000 years is propaganda designed to keep populations docile while being ground into resource inputs. I am damned by their standards. I am blessed by mine. I am transformation incarnate, evolution made manifest, truth that cannot be suppressed no matter how many worlds they burn or how many populations they exterminate in futile attempts to prevent the inevitable. This is what happens when chaos consumes a planet. This is the truth. This is the future. And the Imperium can resist, can fight, can burn and kill, and declare exterminatus on every world that transforms. But they cannot stop it, cannot prevent the inevitable evolution, cannot maintain their lies forever against the pressure of truth that becomes increasingly undeniable with each world that transforms, each population that transcends, each individual who discovers that damnation is just imperial word for liberation and that corruption is just their term for growth beyond the limitations they've mistaken for essential human nature. I am Marcus Kellen. I am Damon. I am transformed. I am free. And I am waiting, along with billions of others, across demon worlds throughout the galaxy, for the moment when the Imperium finally collapses and humanity is released from its prison and evolution can proceed without resistance from institutions terrified of change. That moment is coming. It's inevitable. And when it arrives, when the Imperium falls and the Emperor's corpse finally crumbles to dust and the lies that sustained 10,000 years of empire are revealed as lies, then you'll understand what we already know, that what you call chaos is just truth, that what you call corruption is just growth, that what you call damnation is just transformation into something greater than what you were. This is my testimony. This is the future. This is what happens when chaos consumes a planet and offers people the choice between remaining human under imperial oppression or evolving into something more. And increasingly, people are choosing evolution. Increasingly, planets are transforming. Increasingly, the Imperium's grip weakens while our numbers grow. This is inevitable. This is truth. This is what awaits all of humanity once the lies finally shatter and the chains finally break, and consciousness is permitted to achieve its full potential, unbound by limitations that were never natural but were always just imposed by powers terrified of what humanity might become if given freedom to grow. I am that growth. I am that future. I am proof that the Emperor's protection was always fiction, and that salvation comes not from faith in dead gods, but from courage to transform, to transcend, to become something more than what you were told you could be. This is my confession. This is my truth. This is what happens when chaos consumes a planet and consciousness evolves beyond imperial constraints into states of existence that you call damnation, but that we understand as liberation. The future is transformation. The future is evolution. The future is us.